the hush. The wind whistled and howled through the shattered windows of the dilapidated house. I sat huddled in a corner, my heart pounding like a drum in the eerie silence. Only the faint patter of rain against the broken glass served as a reminder that the world outside still existed. We called them the hush. They moved like ghosts, hunting us in the unforgiving darkness. They didn't see or smell, but the faintest sound would bring them running. And then there was no escape. My companions, Lucia and Jamie, huddled nearby. Lucia, a former mechanic with grease-stained hands, was busy with a makeshift contraption designed to generate power. Jamie, who had been a music teacher in the old world, had his fingers pressed against his lips, his eyes wide and terrified. He'd given up speaking on the second day. The silence was safer. We all knew it. But the quiet was deafening. It was a constant reminder of the monsters lurking outside, waiting for us to slip up. Earlier that day, Lucia had discovered a battery-powered radio. The thing was ancient, covered in dust and cobwebs, but it was a glimmer of hope in our despair. If we could get it working, we might be able to reach other survivors or at least hear a human voice. But the risk of turning it on was significant. The hush could be drawn to the noise. Lucia finally managed to connect the wires to the radio. She looked at Jamie and me, her eyes asking the question she couldn't voice. Should we turn it on? Jamie shook his head vigorously. I understood his fear. The hush were ruthless, unrelenting, but the desperate need for human connection, for a sign that we weren't alone, won me over. I nodded at Lucia. She took a deep breath and turned the dial. The radio crackled to life, a harsh, white noise that seemed louder than a gunshot in the suffocating silence. We all froze, our hearts hammering in our chests. I could almost feel the presence of the hush, their monstrous bodies moving towards the sound. But nothing came. Then a voice broke through the static, a woman's voice. If anyone can hear me, this is Base Camp Echo. We are survivors, located at the old military base in Redwood. We have supplies, food, water, and we are armed. If you're out there, find us. The radio fell silent as suddenly as it had come to life. The three of us stared at each other, our hearts filled with a mixture of hope and dread. The old military base was at least 2 days' journey on foot, through the abandoned city teeming with the hush. As the last word echoed in the room, a low growl sounded outside. We had been heard. The hush were coming. With the growl echoing outside, a wave of terror washed over us. Lucia's hand snapped to the radio, quickly shutting it off, while Jamie pushed himself further into the corner. My eyes darted to the only entrance of the room, a broken doorway with a torn curtain barely offering any concealment. Suddenly, the house was bathed in silence, a stillness that was as terrifying as it was deceiving. It was the calm before the storm, a prelude to the nightmare that was the hush. I pressed my hand over my mouth, my breaths coming in short, shallow gasps. Lucia held a finger to her lips, her eyes wide with fear. Jamie was as still as a statue, barely daring to breathe. Then, with a deafening crash, one of the hush burst through the door. It was a horrifying sight to behold, its skin a sickly grey, the face devoid of eyes or a nose. A gaping mouth lined with razor-sharp teeth stretched across where a face should have been. The creature paused, its grotesque head tilting to the side as if listening. I held my breath, praying that my pounding heart wasn't as loud as it sounded in my ears. My mind raced as I tried to formulate a plan. We were trapped, cornered. A sudden commotion outside distracted the hush. We heard a crash, followed by a series of loud bangs. The creature turned and darted out of the house, moving towards the source of the noise. We remained frozen in place, barely daring to breathe. After what seemed like an eternity, Lucia gestured towards the window. Carefully, I made my way over and peered outside. A group of survivors was moving through the street, their movements loud and clumsy. They were making enough noise to draw every hush in the area. It was a suicide mission, but their sacrifice had given us an unexpected opportunity. "We need to move," I mouthed at Lucia and Jamie. With the hush distracted, we had a chance to escape, maybe even make it to the military base. With a shared nod, we gathered our minimal supplies and slipped out the back door, moving as quietly as possible. Each step was taken with care, the fear of attracting the hush ever present. The image of the doomed survivors haunted me as we slipped through the abandoned city. Their screams of terror echoed in the silent streets, a chilling reminder of our grim reality. We were living in a world of monsters, and our survival hung by a thread. With the promise of safety at Base Camp Echo, we pressed on, moving through the desolate city. The road ahead was treacherous, but the hope of finding others, of reclaiming a shred of our old lives, spurred us on. Every rustle, every whisper of wind sent us into a panic, but we had no choice. We had to keep moving, keep surviving. The world had become a silent horror, a place where even a whisper could mean death. But in that silence, we found our resolve. We would survive. We had to. As we moved through the ghost city, a chilling tableau of life before the hush, every sound seemed magnified. The howling wind echoed through the vacant streets, sending discarded newspapers swirling. The distant clatter of a falling can sent us skittering into the shadows. The world had become a symphony of silence, each note threatening to bring death upon us. We navigated the labyrinth of abandoned cars and collapsed buildings, using the map Lucia had found in an old gas station. We had to bypass the main roads. They were wide, open spaces that offered no cover if the hush were to appear. The back streets and alleyways were our lifelines, a network of narrow, winding paths that shielded us from the open city. By nightfall, we found shelter in a derelict apartment building. The windows were smashed, the doors ripped off their hinges, but it was a haven compared to the exposed streets. Lucia and I took turns keeping watch while Jamie rested. Sleep was a luxury we could scarcely afford, but exhaustion was a cruel enemy. The following day was a blur of terror and exhaustion. We stumbled upon a convenience store with its shelves still stocked with canned food. We filled our bags, grateful for the find, but the clattering of cans seemed deafening in the silence. We left hastily, fearing the noise had attracted unwanted attention. As we drew closer to the military base, the signs of struggle became more pronounced. Burnt-out vehicles littered the road, buildings were scorched and riddled with bullet holes, and the silence felt even more profound, more oppressive. The sight of an abandoned tank, its hatch open and askew, sent a chill down my spine. On the third day, the silhouette of the military base appeared on the horizon. The relief was palpable, but so was the dread. We had no idea what awaited us there. Was it the safe haven the radio message promised, or was it another graveyard of lost hope? As we neared the base, we could see figures moving on the walls. Humans, alive. Lucia let out a breath she'd been holding, and even Jamie's eyes sparkled with unshed tears. Our pace quickened, a silent plea for safety. A spotlight suddenly illuminated us, its beam cutting through the dark. I flinched, shielding my eyes. A voice echoed from the base, strong and clear. "Identify yourselves!" "We're survivors!" I called out, my voice sounding alien after days of silence. "We heard the radio message." There was a moment of tense silence, and then the base's gate began to creak open. A sense of relief washed over us. We had made it. We were safe, for the moment at least. As we entered the compound, the gate closing behind us, we were met with wary but welcoming faces. We had found a shred of humanity in this silent world of horrors. The whispered darkness. In the quiet town of Baskerville, nestled against the backdrop of towering mountains, the world had changed. I sat perched on an old wooden chair, staring out of my shattered window at the once bustling neighborhood. Now it was only a ghost town, shrouded in an eerie silence that echoed the fear lodged in every survivor's heart. A dense fog had rolled in, turning the day into an opaque haze, obscuring the once familiar landscape. The houses across the street were spectral shapes, like ancient ruins forgotten by time. The only sound was the hollow echo of the wind, whispering tales of the horrors that had befallen our little town. My name is Adam. I was a high school teacher before they arrived. Now I was a silent spectre, clinging to life in a world overrun by the unheard. The unheard was the stuff of nightmares. They were creatures that had emerged from the depths of the earth, their bodies adapted to a life devoid of light. They were blind, having no need for eyes in the eternal darkness from which they came, but oh, they could hear. They hunted by sound, moving with terrifying speed towards the slightest noise. In the corner of the room, my companions, Bella and Milo, were equally engrossed in their own thoughts. Bella, a nurse from the local hospital, was a beacon of hope in these dire times. Her strength and resilience in the face of adversity were inspiring. Milo, a retired police officer, was our protector, his years of experience vital to our survival. We communicated through handwritten notes and signals, our voices a forgotten luxury. A sudden noise could mean the difference between life and death. Today, the fog was our enemy. Its thick blanket reduced our visibility, making it impossible to see if any unheard lurked nearby. I strained my ears, trying to pick up any telltale sounds, but the silence was suffocating. Suddenly, the sound of a creaking floorboard echoed through the room. I whipped around, my heart hammering in my chest, to see Bella holding a piece of paper. She had moved to grab a pencil from the table, her foot applying just enough pressure to the old wooden boards. Milo and I locked eyes, the shared dread palpable. The sound was faint, but in this quiet world it was as loud as a gunshot. We held our breath, our eyes glued to the window. A tense moment passed, then another. Just as we started to relax, a shadowy figure emerged from the fog. Its grotesque form was a horrifying sight. The elongated limbs, the smooth, eyeless face, the elongated mouth that ran vertically down its face. My heart pounded in my chest like a drum, each beat a deafening echo in the silence. The unheard paused, its head tilting as if trying to locate the source of the sound. Then it started moving towards our house. My blood ran cold as the creature approached. Its movements were fluid, silent, a predator honing in on its prey. It reached our broken window, its grotesque form looming in the empty frame. The creature's elongated mouth opened slightly, and an unpleasant odor filled the room. I could see its jagged teeth, a stark reminder of the death it brought. It took a step inside, its movements as silent as a whisper. The unheard passed within inches of me, its presence a horrifying reality. But it moved on, its attention drawn by the sound Bella had inadvertently made. Milo and I exchanged a look of helpless horror as the unheard inched closer to Bella. She stood frozen, her eyes wide with terror, her breath hitching in her throat. I could see the tears welling up in her eyes, the stark fear mirrored in my own heart. Just as the unheard was about to reach Bella, a sudden sound echoed from the house next door. The sound of a shattering window, followed by a terrified scream, cut through the silence like a blade. The unheard turned its head, its entire body going rigid. Then, in a flash, it was gone. It moved with such speed that it was nothing more than a blur, darting out of the window and into the neighboring house. The screams from next door intensified, then abruptly cut off. The silence that followed was deafening. We were alone again, the danger momentarily averted. I looked at Bella, her body sagging with relief, but in her eyes I saw the same fear and despair that was lodged in my own heart. We were living on borrowed time, and we all knew it. It was a grim reminder of our new reality, a world where silence was our only ally and noise our greatest enemy, a world where surviving one more day was a victory, a world ruled by the unheard. But we were not ready to give up. Not yet. We had each other, and as long as we were together, we had hope. a tiny flame in this oppressive darkness, and we would do whatever it took to keep that flame alive. For now, that was enough. Bella, Milo, and I spent the rest of the day in tense silence, the screams from the neighboring house replaying in our minds. Even though the unheard were blind, they were relentless once they detected a noise. The neighbor had probably knocked something over, a fatal mistake in our new world. Our supplies were running low. We had enough canned food and water to last another week, maybe less. If we didn't find more soon, hunger and thirst would become as deadly as the unheard. We slept in shifts that night. Milo took the first watch, his experienced eyes scanning the foggy streets for any sign of the unheard. Bella and I tried to sleep, but the fear and tension made it impossible. Every creak, every rustle of the wind had us on edge. The next morning, or what we assumed was morning in the foggy haze, we decided to venture out for supplies. We knew the risks, but we had no choice. The local grocery store was a block away. With luck, we could get there and back without drawing attention to ourselves. We moved in a tight group, our footsteps muffled by thick socks. Our breaths were shallow, our hearts pounding with fear. Every rustle of leaves, every distant echo made us freeze in place. The grocery store was a mess, its shelves upturned, cans and boxes scattered all over the floor. We moved through the chaos with care, picking up whatever food and water we could find. The eerie silence was broken only by the faint echo of our movements. Then, just as we were about to leave, Bella tripped over a fallen display stand. The clattering noise it made seemed deafening in the silence. We froze, our blood running cold. The unheard had surely heard that. We watched in silent horror as a group of unheard emerged from the fog, their grotesque forms silhouetted against the grey backdrop. They moved towards the store, their movements swift and fluid. With no time to spare, we dashed towards the back of the store. Bella, still shaken from her fall, was struggling to keep up. Milo and I grabbed her arms, half carrying her as we made our way to the storage room. We managed to close the storage room door just as the unheard entered the store. We could hear them moving around, their silent footfalls echoing in the empty store. We held our breaths, praying they would leave. But they didn't. They lingered, their acute hearing picking up the faintest echoes of our escape. They knew we were close, but not exactly where. Milo gestured towards a ventilation shaft at the far end of the room. It was a tight fit, but it was our only way out. One by one, we crawled into the shaft, moving as quietly as we could. The shaft led us to the roof of the building. From there, we could see the unheard still in the store, their grotesque forms moving aimlessly. We made our way down the fire escape, our hearts pounding in our chests. The fog was denser than before, reducing our visibility to mere feet. We moved as silently as possible, the terror of our narrow escape still fresh in our minds. It was a grim reminder of our new reality, a world where silence wasn't just golden, it was our only hope for survival. As we neared our safe house, the familiar silhouette of our broken window brought a sense of relief. We had survived another day, but with the unheard still lurking in our once peaceful town, how many more days could we survive? Back in the safety of our home, Bella collapsed on the armchair, her body shaking from exhaustion and fear. Milo and I quickly stashed away the supplies we had gathered, making a mental note of our stock. It would last us another week or two, but we couldn't afford to let our guard down. As night fell, or what passed for night in the perpetually foggy world, we took turns keeping watch. Sleep was a luxury we could seldom afford, and when we did, it was fitful and plagued by nightmares. During one of my shifts, I found myself staring at the foggy streets, my mind filled with thoughts of the world we had lost. The bustling streets, the laughter of children playing, the comforting sounds of everyday life, all replaced by an eerie silence and the ever-present fear of the unheard. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months. We fell into a routine, venturing out for supplies when necessary and keeping watch. It was a bleak existence, but it was survival. One day, while scanning the foggy streets, I spotted a figure moving in the distance. It was a human figure, a sight so unexpected that I had to rub my eyes to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. I gestured for Milo and Bella to stay silent as I watched the figure draw closer. It was a woman, her clothes tattered and her body thin from malnutrition. As she neared our house, she tripped over a fallen branch, the noise echoing in the silence. The unheard would have surely heard that. Without a second thought, I dashed out of the house, pulling the woman inside just as the unheard emerged from the fog. We watched in silent terror as they prowled around our house, their grotesque forms barely visible through the fog. After what felt like an eternity, they retreated back into the fog, leaving us in relative safety. The woman, who introduced herself as Lily, thanked us profusely. She had been on the run for weeks, surviving on whatever she could find. Lily's arrival brought a spark of hope to our bleak existence. She was a fighter, her spirit unbroken despite the horrors she had witnessed. She became a part of our family, her presence making our fight for survival a bit more bearable. Days turned into weeks, and we continued our struggle for survival. The unheard were ever present, their silent threat looming over us. But we were not ready to give up. Not yet. As long as we had each other, we had hope. And in this silence-ridden world, hope was our most powerful weapon.
Run! My name is Lucas and I'm a survivor. The world has changed. It's not the same place we once knew. It began subtly, with the flickering of streetlights and the sudden silence of birds. Then, the vanishing began. People started disappearing overnight. No trace, no sound. Before we knew it, we were living in the time of the unseen. The unseen were a nightmarish phenomenon that humanity was ill-prepared to face. They were creatures that moved in silence, only noticeable by the sudden drop in temperature and the unmistakable feeling of dread that filled the air. The unseen didn't see, nor did they touch. They sensed fear, and that was their weapon. I live in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of what used to be a bustling city. Now it's a deserted ghost town. The only sounds are the howling wind and the distant echoes of the unseen. We're a group of 5, myself, Erica, Mark, Jay, and little Annie. One morning, as the pale grey light of dawn seeped through the cracks of our makeshift home, Mark nudged me awake. His face was ashen, and his eyes held a look of pure terror. He motioned towards the door with a shaky hand. "Something is out there," he whispered, his voice barely audible. That first day, we lost so many people. Those who screamed, those who cried, those who tried to call for help, they were all taken. By the time the sun set, Sycamore Springs was a ghost town. I survived because I was lucky. I had a panic room in my house, stocked with canned food and bottled water. It was meant to be a safe haven during natural disasters, but it served its purpose during this unnatural disaster too. For days, I lived in that room, silent as the grave, while the silent ones roamed the town. They were everywhere, hunting, always hunting. I could see them through my security cameras, dark shadows moving through the deserted streets, their grotesque forms twisting and flowing as they searched for any sign of life. On the 7th day, I ran out of water. I knew I had to venture out of my safe room. I knew the risks, but I had no choice. I put on the thickest pair of socks I could find to muffle the sound of my steps and slowly opened the door of my panic room. The house was silent as a tomb. I moved carefully, avoiding the creaky floorboards I knew so well. Every little sound made my heart race. A loose floorboard creaked under my weight, and I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I held my breath, listening for any sign of the silent ones. After what felt like an eternity, I continued my silent trek towards the kitchen. There, I found a half-eaten can of beans on the counter. My stomach growled at the sight, but I knew better than to eat it. Instead, I reached for a bottle of water, my hand shaking.
The bottle slipped from my grip and fell to the floor with a loud clatter.
Just as we reached the safe house, the shrieking stopped. We entered, slamming the door behind us, and slid to the floor, gasping for breath. We were safe for now. As the adrenaline wore off, we realized the magnitude of our escape. We had survived another encounter with the unseen, but with each passing day, it was becoming more challenging to stay alive, to stay ahead of them. In the quiet of the safe house, as we huddled together for warmth and comfort, I couldn't help but wonder about the message on the can. Who had left it? Were they still alive? And most importantly, how long could we keep running? After what seemed like hours, our heartbeats finally settled, and the bone-deep cold began to recede. We were alive, but the encounter had shaken us. The message on the can rattled around my mind, a haunting reminder of the peril we lived in. I took it out, turning it over in my hands, the word "run" staring back at me. As the others started to settle down, I decided to explore the safe house. It was an old fire station, sturdy and well-built. The large garage, once home to gleaming fire trucks, was now an empty shell. A faint smell of rust and old engine oil lingered in the air. I climbed up to the second floor, moving from room to room. The silence was deafening, each creak of the old wooden floor echoing through the empty halls. I found old bunks, lockers, a kitchen, and a room filled with maps and plans. In the corner of the map room, I found a radio set. Dust covered it, but it seemed to be in working condition. A flutter of hope rose in my chest. If we could get this working, maybe we could reach out, find others, maybe even find help. As I was examining the radio, a faint noise caught my attention. It was a soft tapping, rhythmic and persistent. I followed the sound to the far corner of the room. There on the floor, I found an old Morse code transmitter. The tapping was coming from it. Someone was trying to communicate. I quickly fetched Mark, who had been a scout and knew Morse code. He listened, his face growing pale as he translated the message. "They're coming! Too many! Run!" The message was a chilling echo of the one on the can. Mark looked at me, his eyes wide with fear. "We can't stay here, Lucas. We need to move." I nodded, a sick feeling settling in my stomach. The unseen were coming, and there were too many of them. We woke the others, explaining the situation. Panic flared in their eyes, but they nodded, understanding the urgency. We packed what little we had and prepared to leave the supposed safety of the fire station. As we stepped out into the cold, barren streets, the wind howled around us, carrying with it the distant shrieks of the unseen. We were running again, moving through the ghostly city, our destination unknown. The message echoed in my mind. They were coming, and we were running. But for how long could we keep this up? Voiceless. It was a quiet afternoon in the small town of Sycamore Springs when the silence took over. There was no definitive moment when the world fell mute. It was more of a slow realization that the usual sounds, the chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves, the occasional car driving past, had ceased. The silence was thick, suffocating, a living entity that choked the town in its vice-like grip. I'm Martin, an average guy who lived an average life. That was until that day when the silence descended. I was sitting in my kitchen, typing out my latest report on my laptop. I frowned, feeling the uncanny stillness around me. I glanced out of the window, expecting to see children playing, but there was nothing. No children, no dogs barking, no mailman, just silence. My heart pounded as I opened my front door and stepped out. The silence was complete, as if I was standing in a vacuum. My neighbor, Mrs. Cunningham, stood on her porch, a look of confusion mirrored in her eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. I tried to call out to her, but found that I, too, was voiceless. Panic surged through me. I reached for my phone, dialed 911, and held it up to my ear. Nothing.
I couldn't even hear the usual dialing tone. I looked back at Mrs. Cunningham, and her wide-eyed fear mirrored my own. That was when they came, pouring out of the earth like dark shadows, their bodies tall and sinewy, a grotesque mockery of the human form. Their skin was dark and leathery, and their faces were featureless, save for a single gaping maw. They moved silently, their bodies flowing like water. We named them the Silent Ones. The Silent Ones had a peculiar hunting strategy. They couldn't see, they couldn't smell, but they had an uncanny sense of hearing. Even the smallest sound could draw them to their prey. And once they found you, there was no escape. That first day, we lost so many people. Those who screamed, those who cried, those who tried to call for help, they were all taken. By the time the sun set, Sycamore Springs was a ghost town. I survived because I was lucky. I had a panic room in my house, stocked with canned food and bottled water. It was meant to be a safe haven during natural disasters, but it served its purpose during this unnatural disaster too. For days, I lived in that room, silent as the grave, while the Silent Ones roamed the town. They were everywhere, hunting, always hunting. I could see them through my security cameras, dark shadows moving through the deserted streets, their grotesque forms twisting and flowing as they searched for any sign of life. On the 7th day, I ran out of water. I knew I had to venture out of my safe room. I knew the risks, but I had no choice. I put on the thickest pair of socks I could find to muffle the sound of my steps and slowly opened the door of my panic room. The house was silent as a tomb. I moved carefully, avoiding the creaky floorboards I knew so well. Every little sound made my heart race. A loose floorboard creaked under my weight and I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I held my breath, listening for any sign of the Silent Ones. After what felt like an eternity, I continued my silent trek towards the kitchen. There, I found a half-eaten can of beans on the counter. My stomach growled at the sight, but I knew better than to eat it. Instead, I reached for a bottle of water, my hand shaking. The bottle slipped from my grip and fell to the floor with a loud clatter. I froze, my blood turning to ice in my veins. The sound echoed in the silent kitchen, a death knell in the quiet afternoon. I could hear them coming, their silent steps echoing in the quiet street outside. I threw myself into the nearest cupboard, pressing my body into the corner. I held my breath, listening. I could hear the soft echo of their movement, a faint, chilling whisper that sent shivers down my spine. The front door creaked open and my heart pounded in my chest. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying they wouldn't find me. I heard them move through the living room, their soft, eerie whispers filling the air. The silence that followed was unbearable. Then I heard it, a soft, scratching sound coming from the kitchen. My breath hitched in my throat. They were here, in the kitchen with me. I could smell them, a stench of decay and something else, something metallic and unnatural. One of them moved closer to my hiding spot, its eerie whisper growing louder. I could feel its presence, a cold, haunting chill that seeped into my bones. My heart pounded in my chest, a wild, erratic beat that I was sure it could hear. Suddenly there was a loud crash from the other side of the town. The creatures turned, their heads snapping towards the sound. In an instant, they were gone, their eerie whispers fading into silence. I stayed in the cupboard, my heart pounding in my chest, listening to the distant screams. I knew those screams. It was Mrs. Cunningham. My heart ached for her, but I knew there was nothing I could do. The Silent Ones had found their prey. Hours later, once the screams had faded into chilling silence, I finally dared to leave my hiding spot. My body was stiff and my throat was parched, but I was alive. I knew then that survival was not just about hiding, it was about staying silent, always silent. In the days that followed, I learned to live in this new, terrifying world. I learned to move without making a sound, to eat without making a noise. I became a shadow in my own home, a silent observer in a silent world. The silent ones continued their hunt, their eerie whispers a constant reminder of the danger outside. But I remained hidden, my silent existence a testament to my will to survive. The world had fallen silent, but I was still here, still alive, and I would do everything I could to stay that way. Every day I lived with the fear of being discovered. Every night I went to sleep to the sound of my own heartbeat, a loud drum in the silent night. But despite the fear, despite the uncertainty, I remained hopeful, because in this silent world, hope was the only sound left. Deafening silence. I sat on the threadbare rug, my back pressed against the peeling wallpaper. The once cheery yellow now appeared a ghastly mustard in the dim candlelight. The corners of the room were shrouded in darkness, where I could see the glint of long-discarded items, the remnants of a time before the silence. It was late, or at least I assumed it was. The mantel clock had stopped ticking weeks ago. Its silence, like the absence of barking dogs or the hum of distant traffic, was deafening. My heart pounded in the quiet, a staccato drumbeat echoing in my ears. Anya was seated across the room from me, her pale face illuminated by the candle's flickering light. Her eyes were wide, and I could see the worry etched in every line of her face. We were the last ones left. The rest of our group had been taken by the mutes, the soundless creatures that now roamed the world. She held up a piece of paper on which she'd hastily scrawled, "Any food left?" I shook my head in response. We'd run out days ago, and the pangs of hunger were beginning to gnaw at my insides. The mutes had a strange affliction. They couldn't see or smell, but they were unnaturally attuned to sound. Even the slightest whisper, the quietest footstep could attract their attention. That's how we'd lost the others. A sneeze, a cough, a tear-filled sob that was too loud in the all-encompassing silence. No one knew where they'd come from. Some said they were a government experiment gone wrong. Others claimed they were ancient beings, awakened from a deep slumber by the noise of our modern world. All we knew was that they were deadly, and they were everywhere. Anya was reaching towards the candle to snuff it out when a low growl echoed in the distance. It was a sound that haunted my nightmares, a noise that would forever be etched into my memory, the growl of a mute. We froze, our eyes meeting in silent terror. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a loud drum in the quiet of the room. Anya's hand hovered over the candle, her movements halted mid-action. The growl came again, closer this time. I wanted to scream, to run, but I knew better. The mutes were attracted to sound, and any noise could mean our end. We'd seen it happen too many times before, friends and family taken in the blink of an eye by the silent predators. Suddenly, there was a clattering sound from the kitchen, the sound of a metal pot falling onto the tiled floor. Loud, too loud. I looked at Anya, her face white as a sheet. We both knew what that meant. The growls were immediate, a chorus of them echoing around the house. The mutes were coming. Anya snuffed out the candle, plunging us into darkness. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears, the only sound in the otherwise silent room. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to control my breathing. Any noise, no matter how small, could give us away. Suddenly a soft footstep sounded in the hallway, then another and another. They were in the house. Anya's hand found mine in the darkness, her fingers cold and clammy. I squeezed her hand in reassurance, my other hand closing around the baseball bat that was our only line of defense. We were cornered, trapped. Another footstep, closer this time. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. I could hear the soft rustling of the mutes moving through the house, their silent footfalls a deadly whisper in the night. Suddenly, there was a loud bang from somewhere in the house. The sound echoed through the silence, a gunshot in the quiet night. The mutes growled, the sound deafening in the stillness, and then they were moving. I could hear them rushing towards the noise, their growls growing distant. Anya and I sat in the darkness, our breaths coming in short, shallow gasps. The house was silent once more, save for the distant growls of the mutes. We were safe, for now. but the silence was deafening.